Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest gaming and chatting video. I thought I would go ahead and continue the new book that I'm featuring here within this playlist, the one that's called Horror Video Games, Essays on the Fusion of Fear and Play by Bernard Perron. I'm still on the introduction. This will be part 2 associated with that introduction, and as you can see from part 1 and the rest of this book, it's going to go over several interesting theories, several essays associated with horror within video games, like why they remain such a lasting impact, how they become so popular, and then other information, especially later on in the book, involving information directly from some of the people involved in the games. I can't wait until I get into that part. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's continue part 2 of this introduction. And here's what it says. The video game raises a specific query pinpointed by Thomas Apperley in Genre and Game Studies toward a critical approach to video game genres. He says, it is by turning to the notion of interactivity in particular that new notions of video game genre are able to emerge from the domination or remediated genre categories. The ergodic dimension of games extends the scope of the generic study. Take the lists of the top scariest games regularly published in video game magazines, on websites, and even made into a series of clips that can be reviewed on video sharing websites like YouTube. We find games like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Silent Hill 2, Fatal Frame, Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, Doom, Doom 3, Half-Life, and System Shock 2. If the first 6 games are in the tradition of the survival horror, that is third-person action-adventure games where the vulnerability of the player's character is played out through not-so-powerful weapons and limited ammo and health, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth proposes an action-adventure from a first-person perspective. Starting with Doom, the final 3 games are first-person shooters, relying on or centered on combat and shooting. On the top of their semantic elements and syntactic relationships, borrowed from fantastic, detective, and science fiction genres in literature and film, those scary games also blurred the boundaries in relation to the gameplay. With the recent release of Silent Hill Origins for the Sony PlayStation Portable, the adaptation of the first Resident Evil for the Nintendo DS, Resident Evil Deadly Silence, and the first-person shooter Dementium, The Ward, and rail shooter Touch of Dead for the same DS, the videoludic horror is leaving, with effective results, the home for the handheld game consoles. Moreover, the essence of the survival horror genre has recently been debated on blogs, online gaming discussion communities, and video game magazines. Leigh Alexander asks, does survival horror really still exist? Jim Sterling adds how survival horror evolved itself into extinction, and Sid Suman and Patrick Shaw opened their report of Resident Evil 5 with action or horror. The possible vanishing of the genre is announced because of the increasing focus on action and the possible vanishing of the Japanese, more thought-provoking way of dealing with the genre. Reacting to Dead Space, Alexander wonders, so whatever happened to our imperfect, psychologically damaged heroes, our creepy little doll rooms, our feeble switchblades, our crawling dead, and why have they been replaced by gun-toting professionals and space marine types? As if gaming needed any more space marines. In fact, with Capcom's Resident Evil 4, and certainly with the cooperative mode of Resident Evil 5, the survival horror game mechanics seem to have moved towards more heroic, tough, and robust protagonists whose attacks are more centered on shooting with more powerful firearms and more ammunition. And successful horror games such as Condemned, Criminal Origins, and a Japanese-influenced Fear, First Encounter, Assault Recon, are first-person shooters, the first one placing emphasis on melee combat game. No doubt that with better artificial intelligence, physics, rendering capacities, and game controls, the videoludic horror is revolving. In the words of Chris Pruitt, games are not created in a vacuum. Game design is like DNA, combining and mutating with each new generation. As a new Nightbreed is coming, emphasizing again the importance of studying this genre, we need to immediately scrutinize the past and the present ones. The next segment is called Taking Two Strategic Approaches. Knuckling down to work and fill in the blank and gap in some game studies between general theory and analysis of particular genres and games, this collection of essays has been divided into two sections. First one is called Approaching the Genre. The first section addresses the question of horror genre in the video game. Creative director and writer of The Suffering and its sequel, The Suffering Ties That Bind, Richard Rouse III, begins this section with a great insider's appraisal in Match Made in Hell, the inevitable success of the horror genre in video games. With practical considerations and references to game mechanics, he explains why horror stories work so effectively in video games. He shows that with their immersive and empowerment nature, video games can scare players in ways far beyond what other mediums have been able to obtain. For Rouse, the future of horror games is bright. As promising as the future of horror games may appear, Carl Therien underlines in Games of Fear, a multifaceted historical account of the horror genre of video games, how the history of the genre and of the video games in general is far from being written. Non-linear, his historical account examines to what degree the horror genre has affected the many gameplay types it was associated with throughout the history of the medium. As he says, understanding how horror video games integrated and modified pre-existing figures of interactivity and which figures came to be associated with the genre constitutes an interesting way to study the phenomenon. Closely relating to the matter broached in the previous section of this introduction, Therien also considers the notion of genre and uses Zvetan Todorov's theory of fantasy literature and his distinction between the uncanny and the marvelous. Genre definitions are also at the core of Laurie N. Taylor's essay, Gothic Bloodlines in Survival Horror Gaming. For Taylor, survival horror, like any genre, is a loose category. It has been used to label games that are not always horror and are not always survival. Consequently, to fully understand survival horror games and the creation and function of horror in games, Taylor traces the history and influence of other important factors like the Gothic. Her essay defines the Gothic in prior media and covers the conventions established in Gothic literature, especially in terms of process and materiality. It explains how the Gothic transfers and changes within video games, as well as how those changes impact gaming overall, and especially gaming's ability to create horror. Taylor uses the term ludic Gothic to refer to games that may be generically classified as horror or Gothic, but which are dependent on the boundary crossing that is definitional to the Gothic in other forms. Ewan Kirkland's storytelling in survival horror video games explores the use of storytelling as an organizing element of horror video games, the methods of narration they employ, and the relationship between storytelling and horror effect. The essay deals with narrative's role as it facilitates gameplay, aids players' progress, and enriches the gaming experience. As cutscenes are prominent in survival horror, Kirkland also examines the ways different media are employed to situate gameplay in narrative context and to apply past or future narrative events, i.e., newspaper articles, lab reports, photographs, diaries, audio cassettes, painted portraits, computer logs. He also analyzes the various ways the game space and the gameplay contribute to narrative processes, from the virtual camera cuts and the predetermined events triggered by the avatar's movement to the requirement to pick up and correctly use narratively loaded objects and the very narrow ideal route the gamer has to take. In Shock Horror, first-person gaming horror and the art of ludic manipulation, Dan Pinchbeck concentrates on first-person shooters. He is revealing the ubiquity of horror in the genre. Pinchbeck investigates the pervasion of horror themes and the imagery in first-person shooters, from the basic definition of computer games as systems of effective manipulation and the use of psychological constructs. By offering readings of key FPS titles and demonstrating how in-game content contributes to the manipulation of expectations, behavior, and effect, Pinchbeck demonstrates that a psychological approach to understanding the functional nature of horror themes, images, devices, and schema in FPS games increases the understanding of why such a hallowed relationship exists. Considering that many survival horror classics have been made in Japan, Martin Picard takes a look at Japanese horror video games in Haunting Backgrounds, Transnationality and Intermediality in Japanese survival horror video games. Picard's point of view definitely remains transnational and intermedial in order to interrogate the Japanese-ness of the games and to disclose their intriguing mix of Japanese and Western themes and audiovisual aesthetics. The essay calls into question the Orientalist and Essentialist functions of Japanese icons and survival horror games for the Japanese video game industry. It also analyzes how some games revive and revitalize significant cultural figures such as the ghosts and spiritual beings found in the Japanese myths and legends of classical literature and art, and how they explicitly borrow the same atmospheric aesthetic of Japanese visual arts from the first paintings of the Nara period to the recent trends in Japanese horror films. The horror film is defined as a body genre because its bodily and aesthetic excess is causing the body of the spectator to be caught up in an involuntary mimicry of the emotion or sensation of the body on the screen. Insofar as the gamer is not only caught up in this involuntary mimicry, but is also urged to act and feel through its presence, agency, and embodiment in the fictional world. The survival horror extends to those bodily sensations. Bernard Perron's The Survival Horror, the extended body genre, studies those corporalized responses in relation to the three different bodies engaged in the videoludic horror experience: the body of the monster, the body of the player character, and the body of the gamer. Then that's it. Let's go ahead and let's pause it here. So again, this is the introduction, part 2 of the book Horror Video Games Essays on the Fusion of Fear and Play by Bernard Perron. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. Interesting stuff. I liked how it delved into that smallish time frame where shortly after horror video games took on a life of their own, it characterized Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Doom, Fatal Frame. Those are the ones that come to mind. There was that brief period, you remember, where things went into portable machines like the Nintendo DS or the PlayStation Portable. I can't remember. There was one more, but I can't remember the other one. Remember how those games, like, it was all of a sudden they weren't there and then they're there, and everything was being pushed to those portable games. And I remember that the video games obviously were being made for them as well. And I like how it said that pretty much that it didn't work. You know, how there was obviously a big shift when it comes to trying to make a horror game work well when you're just staring like at a 5-inch screen. It's a lot different when you have a big screen with surround sound stereo, and in some cases other type of devices that move or motion with the actual game as opposed to playing it here. I also like the other analysis that it gave when it comes to are horror games now action games, and I do believe that. I blame Resident Evil for that. Resident Evil definitely took on more of, at least for a while there, more of a shoot 'em up type game, and otherwise it had zombies or other type of scares in it, but it was far cry from the world of Silent Hill when it comes to that type of horror. But let me know what you guys think. Next part will finalize the introduction of this book, and then we'll be able to start focusing on the other chapters. Great stuff. All right, everyone, thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.